Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss my general thinking on why it is that the section of the British population that determines our government will change its mind on objections to freedom of movement, which is the topic of the week really. The only thing really as well blocking rejoining the single market. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So I was asked by a few people over the last couple of days actually in the comments why I'm so sure that we can just remove objections to freedom of movement when xenophobia seems to be deeply entrenched in Britain, or at least amongst people who are instrumental during elections. And it's a fair question. Xenophobia is at the absolute heart of objections to freedom of movement. There are no practical reasons to oppose it. The xenophobes will talk about pressure on local services, schools, hospitals, housing and so on. But immigrants contribute more to the economy than UK citizens on average. They also take less out of the system. But the same xenophobia exists in EU countries as well. The majority of the population in most of these countries, particularly after Brexit, are slapping them down, just as we used to in the UK. The situation is as it is because the government joined their ranks instead of opposing them as they once did. But that will change, hopefully before very much longer. The other thing about xenophobia is that it is an ideology. Now, people will commit the most ridiculous acts of self-harm for the sake of ideology, as long as they think it hurts someone else more. You can see it in Brexit debates on social media. I say debates. You know, the Brexit supporters, unable to point at ways in which their life is better, revel in the fact that it has upset their Remainer countrymen and women. That is, causing others more pain than them is all they have to hold on to. But those people are bell ends. Most people aren't like that. Most people are unpleasant. They will not deliberately suffer self-harm or even inflict harm on others for the sake of ideology. When it comes to a choice between a philosophy and having a roof over their heads, clothes on their back, food on their table, people will choose the essentials of life over philosophy every time. Political ideology is not for people who are starving or homeless. We've all experienced it to some degree, when we suddenly feel the loss of something that we feel is important to us. It may not be to someone else, it may be quite petty, but suddenly we lose something really important. And whatever it might have been, suddenly you don't care about more trivial things. It's why there are some Remainers, or were some Remainers in 2019, who weren't necessarily opposed to a no-deal Brexit, if we had to leave the EU at all. Some said, well, let's leave under the maddest circumstances possible then. Inflict the maximum Brexit pain. Reason being, that will get people to see the reality much sooner and demand a return much more urgently. Because we can imagine this in reverse. If you imagine a very soft Brexit, imagine we'd left the EU, but not the single market and not the customs union. We had some sort of EEA Brexit. We wouldn't have experienced the economic pain. I would still argue that we're now following rules, adopting trade agreements that we're not involved in deciding, and I would still argue that we should have full membership. But we wouldn't have experienced the same level of the combination of high inflation and low growth, which marks us out from every other advanced economy, with maybe the exception of Russia, who adopted their own mad departure from sanity. It'd be much harder to argue for a return to the EU because people wouldn't be feeling the pain from Brexit. We would still have Tories in power. They would still be failing to deal with the other problems. But Brexit wouldn't be depriving people of food, livelihoods or shelter, and no one would be claiming it would. But although we didn't exit with a no-deal Brexit, it wasn't very far off. We get very little benefit from the deal we have. What's more, the government's recent Brexit budget statement means that a population that's already struggling with the cost of living is going to suffer much more. Economists are pointing out that the government have set up a massive debt time bomb for people. The government is borrowing heavily over the next few years. This is fine because we're facing economic shockwaves. But unlike when it has done this during the pandemic or during the banking crisis, the Bank of England is instead of buying up government bonds, quantitative easing, it's selling them off. The practical upshot of this for ordinary people is that there's going to be a shortage of cash over the next few years. People are going to be facing higher costs, but lower incomes in real terms. And it's all down to economic policies, not global pressures. This is not going to be a problem you're going to be reading about in the papers of other advanced economies with a functioning government. So what's going to happen is that more and more people are not going to be able to afford basics like food, energy, housing. And the warnings I've seen from multiple sources in the economic news as well from some economists firsthand, as well as the media outlets, is that we are headed for a time when people just won't be able to cope. Those who can will borrow in order to manage a bit longer, but eventually too many people will run out of sustainable ways to cope. So let's go back to freedom of movement now. If people were getting by and being told that, well, we could do even better in the single market, you would be met with scepticism. After all, we just left it. Why don't we give it a bit longer? People don't want to do the hokey cokey here. Brexit was a pain in the arse. They want to move on. But it's not just a case of we could do better in the single market, but you can go from being unable to cope to being able to cope in the single market. That's different. People are headed for very bad times to come, and everyone knows it. You'd be hard pushed to find anyone remotely independent who thinks the government's economic plans are in any way sensible. It doesn't matter whether you ask people on the right or the left wing of politics. Only the most partisan of Tory government supporters is supporting this latest budget statement. And even many of those are unable to do so. That is because, yes, a lot of commentators don't understand anything technical and make no effort to try. But for those who do, they understand what's coming. And what do people really have against freedom of movement anyway? In 2016, they were told it was costing them their jobs. Well, if they're still struggling to get a decent job, which they are, doesn't really seem that freedom of movement was the problem, was it? The immigration from beyond the EU, I mean, that was always a stupid one, but they pushed that. Well, that's been reported as a much greater problem since we ended freedom of movement. You've ended freedom of movement, and the problem you said that it would solve has got way worse. Seriously, if people stop and think about it, what benefits to ending freedom of movement were they sold that has actually been delivered since it actually did end? It ended nearly 2 years ago. Our businesses are failing, people's incomes are failing in real terms, everything has gone to shit. Rather than wondering, why do you think people would suddenly decide they're in favour of freedom of movement, or at least accept it for the benefits of rejoining the single market, I can't understand why anyone would think that people will continue to be opposed to freedom of movement. There is not a single argument against it that has not been proven magnificently wrong. And as I say, when you're talking about people who are struggling to afford the cost of energy, housing, food, clothing, you tell them it gets better if we're back in the single market. You weren't like this in the single market. They don't care about freedom of movement. They don't care about these nebulous objections to freedom of movement. Can I have my egg and chips? Yeah, you can have your egg and chips in the single market. All right then. And the already shifting public attitude to Brexit will continue to go in only one direction. Even GB News, they couldn't even get their echo chamber to support Brexit. They posted a Twitter poll to ask if given the chance again, their followers would vote for or against Brexit. Against Brexit won by 55% to 45%. On GB News. And I know obviously it'll have been shared around other groups as well. But GB News, when you post a Twitter poll, you are largely going to get people who are aligned with your views answering it. Against Brexit won 55% to 45% on a GB News poll. But anyway, there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.